So it's appropriate that they put a thing celebrating Yom Kippur before I get up here because Mitch is a Yankees fan. I'm an Astros fan. I had the privilege of him taking me to a game in Yankee Stadium where the Astros promptly no-hit the Yankees. And he's never forgiven me for that experience. But I rejoiced in his kindness. So anyway, I want to discuss a topic that academics discuss, but that actually has practical implications, and that has to do with the promise of God. How far does the promise of God extend? What does it mean for the promise of God to extend in this kind of direction? And does the extension end up nullifying the original force of the promise? So that's how I'm going to do it. So I framed it as, does Israel become the world? And I'll explain why as I go through this. So, whoa, that was exciting. It is often claimed that the New Testament moves the promise to Israel as a people in the land to being about God's people in the world. Such a claim I see in as varied a set of discussions as Bruce Waltke's illustration of a promise to the fathers was made a promise of $5 and he ends up being rewarded with $5,000. So Waltke's point is there was a promise made to a certain limited group of people, but in the end, Jesus ends up blessing the world. It's a much bigger promise. We should be excited about the big promise and not worry so much about the little promise. To fuller treatments by people like W.D. Davies and Gary Burge. The question is whether the universal expanse of the promise in Christ neuters the specific promise made to Israel of being a people in a land. It is a question I wish to consider. It's a question not so often probed, is how often the promise to Israel is actually made. In other words, how often is it reaffirmed, and with what kinds of terms is it reaffirmed with? Linked to other parts of God's commitment, and then restated. And that's what I want to consider in the time that I have with you this afternoon. Claim is often simply supported by the observation that the New Testament does not say much directly about the specific promise to Israel as a people, with much wider attention being given to the more comprehensive universal promise for all the earth. Yes, Jews are included in blessing. Jews are placed alongside Gentiles. There's the hope about how the gospel has gone out into all the world. That's what you see the New Testament doing. The observation is technically correct, that this is where you see the emphasis in the New Testament. But it misses a couple of key points in the historical context in which the New Testament was written. First, Israel is in the land during the time of the New Testament, so there is little need to remind the nation of a promise that is already in place. Just don't think about that too hard, okay? But I will claim that's not rocket science. All that is needed for the promised peace to accompany it is for God to complete his promise for the people who are already there. As Craig Blazing and I said earlier, the issue in the New Testament writings was not a return to the land, since they were already in the land, but the return of the Messiah and a proper relationship to him, which would guarantee everlasting inheritance in the kingdom of glory which he would establish there in that land. Second point is, Israel's a people among the nations. In other words, that's another point that's highlighted. Israel is among the people of the nations. That's another element of the biblical hope. And we talk about a new earth, an earth as it was and as it will be, which does not exclude the presence or the existence of the nation of Israel. So with those 2 points as background, I want to turn my attention now to the promise and take a look at it itself. So here we're going to start in Genesis 12, and I'm going to quickly run through some passages in the Pentateuch, and then we'll move on from there. Beyond this, it's important to note how widespread and specific this promise is from God to Israel. It is crucial to see how it is grounded in God's character, and so is in place for perpetuity. One of the points I'm going to be making, and if you go to sleep in the next 5 minutes, if you're hearing me now, you will get one of the main points I'm making, and it's this, and that is that God has made a personal commitment to Israel that he has expressed that's rooted in the truthfulness of his character and in the truthfulness of his promises. So we're talking about God's faithfulness when we're talking about hope for Israel and commitments that God has made to a certain people, even in the midst of whatever he does with the rest of the world. So let's look at that now. The promise of a people and a land is tied to commitments God made to Abraham in Genesis 12, 1-3. The issue of the land leads off this promise in verse 1. It says, "Now the Lord said to Abraham, go out from your country, your relatives, your father's household, to the land I will show you." The people of Israel are going to exemplify divine blessing, and that's stated in verse 2. That verse declares, "Then I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, so that you will exemplify divine blessing." And if you stop and think about the story of the Pentateuch, within the Pentateuch, it is how God took this one person and his family and developed it into a nation so that by the time we get to Exodus, we have a people who are as numerous as the stars in the sky or the sand by the sea. So we're talking about a group of people that are intentionally developed, and really the Pentateuch is the story in part of the emergence of this people of God whom God has called and whom God is involved with. This is part of what makes their testimony a lasting one. They function as a people and as a witness to God. That witness is not just seen in the person of Messiah. This very Israel is distinguished from the nations within this promise in verse 3, as blessing to the world will come through them and through the seed of Abraham. Now, it's the seed of Abraham that's going to be the topic of discussion and debate as we think about this. Verse 3 states, "I will bless those who bless you, but the one who treats you lightly I must curse, so that all the families of the earth may receive blessing through you." So it's through the seed of Abraham that the world's going to be blessed. And of course, seed here has two meanings that are operating simultaneously. There's a singularity to the seed on the one hand, and Galatians 3 will pick that up when it says the seed is Christ. But there's also a seed that is a plurality that becomes the people of Israel, and that's the story of the Pentateuch. And you don't choose between those two. Those two are related to one another because one of the brilliant things about the Christ, of course, is he is of the seed of Israel. He is one Israelite himself. So there's this juxtaposition that is important and that we not lose sight of. I like to tell people when you think about the promise of the seed, it's not every descendant of Abraham who's a part of this promise, because you have Esau distinguished from Jacob, exactly right, okay? And you have the various tribes of Israel, but the line comes through Judah. So there's a singularity in the line alongside the development of the seed, and you're watching both things happen together. Sometimes theologians get themselves in trouble when they force a choice you don't have to make. They say it's either this or that when it may be both and I think that's part of what we have going on here. So it says in Genesis 12, when we reinforce this promise from Genesis 12:3 in verse 7, it says this. Genesis 12:7 speaks of this promise as being for Abraham's descendant or seed, and this verse reads, "To your descendants I will give this land." Now you could read that and go, well, so to Jesus I'm going to give this land. Well, yeah, but I don't think that's the point. The point is, no, there's a group of people for whom this land, there's a nation for whom this land has been developed and created for. That verse reads, "To your descendants I will give this land." In Genesis 13:15-16, so this promise is getting repeated as we move through the Pentateuch. The seed promise is repeated. I will give all this land to you and your descendants forever. And then here's the point that shows the corporate nature of this promise. "And I will make your descendants like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone is able to count the dust of the earth, then your descendants also can be counted." Okay, now you have an assignment tonight. I want you to go out and I want you to grab some dirt in your yard. And I want you to pour it out in front of you. Take off the grass off the top, okay? And just do the dirt part and just scatter among you and just count the little pieces that are there, okay? And I bet you'll get past the number 1. So you know, there's going to be more than just that one little piece there that's going to be staring you in the face. The promise makes clear that the promise isn't just for the Christ, but it's also related to people who are descended and connected to the Christ. At least that's eventually how it's going to manifest itself. Now, in the New Testament, the seed is seen as Jesus the Christ. There's no doubt about this. Galatians 3:16 couldn't be clearer. It makes a point, with this particular emphasis, the seed is not many, it's one. Okay? And he is the seed par excellence. He is the seed of the seed, if you want to think about it that way. And he's the one who executes the promise. But Israel as a people among the nations still remains as a part of that promise. So I can have Christ be in the middle of the promise, even be the hub of the promise, and that doesn't mean I've excluded Israel in the process. Because I will remind you that Yeshua is also the Messiah of the people of Israel. That's part of what's being confessed about him. So there is a relationship that he has to them as this promise is being played out. Well, I've just given you a couple of places where it was repeated right after the promise was given, but the story continues. The promise is reiterated to the patriarchs in numerous places, with the land for her being specifically mentioned. It isn't dropping out along the way. It isn't just, oh, I'm going to bless you. No, I'm going to bless you as a people in a land where you can live in peace. So the land is being specifically mentioned. Land is specifically mentioned in the reaffirmation of the promise to Abraham. It's mentioned in 3 passages. I'm not going to read them to you, but I'll just note them. Genesis 15, 5-7, and then verses 18 to 21 in the same chapter, chapter 15, and then 17, 1-8. But that's just Abraham. Okay? Now, God must think that we forget things. So as the story continues, he reminds people of this promise. So when we get to Isaac, it's again, the promise is mentioned with the land in view in Genesis 26, 2-5. And then to Jacob, it's reiterated in Genesis 28, verses 3 and 4, and 13 to 15. From this set of texts, one can conclude that the promise of blessing as a people involves the inclusion of a land for them that is at peace among the nations. That's what's on offer here. The book of Genesis ends with a promise about this land, as Joseph was buried in a cave located in a field at Machpelah. And here's the passage from Genesis 50:24, which I will cite. But God will surely come to you and lead you from this land to the land he swore on oath to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So it's like God says to Abraham, I'm going to give you land. And then God says to Isaac, I'm going to give your people a land. And then God says to Jacob, I'm going to give your people a land. And then God says to a buried Joseph, but he counts, all right, because God does stuff with dead people. All right, I'm going to give you a land. So I think the point is, okay, like I said, this is not rocket science. Israel's going to get a land. This idea is not limited to the book of Genesis, however. The Lord says to Moses in Exodus 6:4, I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan where they were living as resident foreigners. And then again in verse 8 of chapter 6 of Exodus, I will bring you to the land I swore to give to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, and I will give it to you as a possession. I am the Lord. Okay, I think that close is the character thing that I was talking about. He makes this promise and he says, I'm the Lord who's making this promise. I will keep my word. I will do this. This remark is a complete promise from God about the covenant's inclusion of a land for this people as a core part of its content. When a point is made about a possession, there is no indication that possession is temporary. Nor is there any indication this part of the promise of the land being theirs forever is conditional, as is sometimes argued, that this promise of the land is conditional and disobedience means loss of the land. No, disobedience means discipline. It may mean discipline in the land or discipline outside the land, but it doesn't nullify the promise itself that one day the land will belong to this people. So, this claim needs a closer look. So I want to ask another question now. Now that we've established that the land is something that's inherent to the promise, let's take a look at whether or not the promise is conditional. Okay, because if the promise is conditional, then all the work I just did was fun. Okay? But it's not true. So let's think about this. So when we get to the blessings and cursings in Deuteronomy 28 to 32, what is conditioned is their well-being and security in the land. It is an elevation among the nations and blessing that are in view, Deuteronomy 28:1, verse 8 and verse 12 as well. Disobedience will lead to defeat and fleeing, curses on the city and field, basket, mixing bowl, children, soil, calves, lambs, in one's going in and coming out. You don't want to experience this, okay, just a recommendation. That's Deuteronomy 28:15 to 37 mentions all those groups. Fleeing the land is part of this warning, as is servitude to the nations, Deuteronomy 28:48 and 49. But the commitment of the land to the people is permanent, and it doesn't change the ultimate status of the promise, or at least we need to look at that question. The first hint of the answer is in Deuteronomy 28:62, where the remark appears that there will be very few of you left, though at one time you were as numerous as the stars in the sky, because you will have disobeyed the Lord your God. So you've got a second assignment, okay? You just put the dirt on the ground to find out that there's more than one piece to the promise. Now your assignment tonight is, assuming it's not cloudy, which may not be a good assumption in Chicago, but look up at the sky and just see how many stars there are up there. And just ask yourself, how many, what does that represent? What does that picture? Why would he use that image? Judgment for disobedience is severe and it's devastating, but it's not the last word. Verses 63 and 64 of Deuteronomy 28 say this judgment includes uprooting them from the land and scattering them among the nations. Yet Deuteronomy 30 speaks of a reversal of all this horrible judgment, as the Lord has pity on Israel as she turns back to God. Then the Lord brings them back to the land and to a place of blessing. That's Deuteronomy 30, verses 1 to 4. And then in verse 5, the blessing means more blessing, even than that was received before by their ancestors. Not only am I going to bring you back to the land, not only am I going to honor the promise that I made to the patriarchs, their experience, you're going to have a better experience. The section ends with a call to the nation to obey, with the note that disobedience means severe destruction, but repentance brings restoration. That's the point of chapters 30, verses 11 to 20. And then Deuteronomy 32 even has the Song of Moses to commemorate all this. A blessing on each of the 12 tribes follows in Deuteronomy 33. Nothing in any of this suggests the door is closed to Israel permanently, nor that the land will not be theirs at some time in the future. What is needed when the land is lost is a turning back to God. The pattern was seen within the Old Testament when Assyria and Babylon overran the land, with the promises explaining what had taken place. And when they explained what had taken place, this was the pattern they were appealing to. So this brings us to, where we've done the Pentateuch. What about after the Pentateuch? Okay, so you have a sense if we're working our way through the Bible, you understand where I'm going. In Joshua 21:43, the remark is made that, quote, the Lord gave Israel all the land he had solemnly promised to their ancestors, close quote. This was not the fulfillment of this promise, i.e. a final fulfillment, as that included the idea of peace in the land, but it was the start of its realization of a land with security in place, yet with all the responsibilities to obey remaining as part of its occupancy. As already noted, displacement from the land did take place in two key stages with Assyria and Babylon, but did any of that change the ultimate status of this promise that one day Israel would be in the land? Two texts in Jeremiah help us to answer that question, so I've really just fasted forward. Okay, we've gone from Joshua to Jeremiah in a single Olympic leap broad jump, so I hope you're still with me. Okay, someone said they needed coffee before this talk, and I promised to keep them awake. So this broad jump is one way to do it. So Jeremiah 11, 1 to 17, reviews the history of the nation and the covenant, noting that disobedience brings judgment. And then he describes the fact that the nation is under the effects of the curse of Deuteronomy. Sound familiar? The curse of Deuteronomy? Okay, for her current disobedience. To it is matched Jeremiah 32 and 33. In Jeremiah 32, the prophet is directed by the Lord's message to buy a field at Anathoth. It symbolizes that Israel will come back to the land. Jeremiah 32:22 says it this way: you kept the promise that you swore on oath to the ancestors. That's God being addressed. He's keeping his word. You gave them a land flowing with milk and honey. Then the Babylonians are said to have come in verses 23 and 24 because of disobedience. Verse 25 closes the summary about the earlier purchase of the land. The city is sure to fall into the hands of the Babylonians, yet in spite of this, you, sovereign Lord, have said to me, but that field was silver, and buy that field with silver and have the transaction legally witnessed. Okay, this is going to be relevant to you one day. Sometimes it pays to have a deed to the land. Jeremiah 32:26-44 summarizes what is going on. Babylon comes because of disobedience, yet as verses 37-38 make clear, quote, I will certainly regather my people from all the countries where I have exiled them in my anger, fury, and great wrath. I will bring them back to this place and allow them to live here in safety. They will be my people, and I will be their God. Verses 40-41 is even more emphatic. I will make a lasting covenant with them that I will never stop doing good to them. I will take delight in doing good to them. I will faithfully, notice the word, I will faithfully and wholeheartedly plant them firmly in the land. It is in this context we get the new covenant for Israel and Judah that Jeremiah had just mentioned in Jeremiah 31, verses 31-34. He seals that earlier promise with another affirmation in Jeremiah 31:37. Quote, the Lord says, I will not reject all the descendants of Israel because of all they have done. That could only happen if the heavens above could be measured or the foundation of the earth below could all be explored. Okay, so you've got to go to the end. This is assignment number 3, okay? But this one will be hard, okay? You need to go into a spacecraft and just go to the end of the universe. Okay, your assignment, should you choose to accept it, is to go to the end of the universe. This tape will not destruct in 5 seconds. Okay, so you just need to, and just go and keep going. And when you get to the end, then maybe this promise will get reversed. Okay, that's kind of a way of saying it's going to happen. So, and now, we also have Jeremiah 33:17, where he notes the people will never be without a descendant of David once the promise comes, as he says, for I, the Lord, promise, David will never lack a successor to occupy the throne over the nation of Israel. And he seals the promise with this word in verses 20 and 21, I, the Lord, make the following promise, quote, I have made a covenant with the day and the night that they will always come at the proper times. Only if you people could break that covenant could my covenant with David and my covenant with the Levites ever be broken. So David will by all means have a descendant to occupy his throne as king, and the Levites by all means have priests who minister before me. Close quote. So now you've got a 4th assignment, okay? And that is if you can alter the days and the nights, okay, then maybe this will change. Okay, so I've given you 2 assignments I think you can do. I've given you 2 assignments that if you embark on trying them out, okay, we're going to be waiting a long time for you to realize them. All right, so that's kind of where we're sitting. So where do I want to pick up? Let's see. So it's God's own word and promise that underlies this commitment. It's as secure as the days and nights are, so secure are God's promises to the nation of Israel in the midst of the nations at large. Whatever else happens with the promise in the Christ, whatever expansion that promise involves, it does not involve the elimination of these commitments to the people of Israel. God says it is the creation that is the witness to his commitments to this promise. There is a similar cycle to this noted in Ezekiel 20. Okay, we've got a manifold example of prophetic witnesses to this. That summary of disobedience and judgment followed by restoration ends this way in Ezekiel 20, 40-41. Quote, when I bring you out from the nations and gather you from the lands where you were scattered, I will accept you along with your soothing aroma. I will display my holiness among you in the sign of the nations. Then you will know I am the Lord, that when I bring you to the land of Israel, to the land I swore to give to your father. He made a commitment to the patriarchs, and he's not going back on it. 2 things are of note here. First, This is a promise of Israel's fate as she exists among the nations. The picture prevents a reading that simply absorbs Israel into the nations. And then second, the original covenant promise to Abraham is the basis for the action. God keeps his word. Okay, so concluding observations on Israel, the land, and the promise, although I think you kind of get my drift. Okay, and there are lots of, I just cite texts. All right? The picture of other earlier prophetic texts also show this kind of scenario where God keeps his promise to Israel, that is, as a people. Isaiah 2, 1-4 speaks of all the nations streaming to Jerusalem in a time of peace. Isaiah 2, 2 and 3 reads, quote, "In future days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will endure as the most important of mountains and the most prominent of hills. All the nations will stream to it. Many peoples will come and say, 'Come, let us go up to the temple of the God of Jacob, so he can teach us his requirements and we can follow his standards. For Zion will be the center of moral instruction, and the Lord's message will issue from Jerusalem.'" That's Isaiah 2. The nations' disputes will be judged by the Lord there. This foresees Israel at peace in her land in the midst of the nations. Again, not absorbed by them. Those nations are also at peace with her and with God. Imagine what that time could be like. Isaiah 19, 16-25 picks up this image and sees a highway running from Egypt to Assyria. Now, normally when you read in the Old Testament, you read about Egypt or you read about Assyria, you're thinking Israel's enemies. Sees a highway running from Egypt to Assyria that also includes participation by Israel. All three will worship God together on this earth, nations and people united, yet each with their own identity as well. Isaiah 19:25 reads, "The Lord of heaven's armies will pronounce blessing over the earth, saying, 'Blessed be my people, Egypt, the work of my hands, Assyria, and my special possession, Israel.'" Three peoples, distinct identities, now united in the shalom that God is bringing. All are blessed by the Lord. Egypt is my people, Assyria is the work of God's hand, and Israel as God's special possession. Now, that's the Old Testament, okay? What about the New? Okay? And I'll just remind you that when the New Testament was written, all you had was the Hebrew Scripture. So when we call it the New Testament, we're reflecting our own history and looking back. But at the time at which the New Testament is written, it's just presenting the gospel as Jesus presented it. So there is a New Testament part to this promise as well. It's where Israel's role in all of this is restated by Jesus and the apostles. Sometimes when I'm having this debate with scholars who say, we're Christocentric, we believe in what Christ said. Christ came to bring blessing to the world, and all the world's going to be blessed, so why is there this special relationship to Israel? My response is, well, if you think Christ is the center and he is the fulfillment, in fact, there's a debate. The debate goes like this. There's replacement theology. Israel's been replaced by the nations. Okay, and sometimes we on our side of the debate use that term to describe what others believe, and we go, oh, we don't like replacement theology. But the replacement theology people will say, no, don't call it replacement theology, call it fulfillment theology, because Jesus fulfills it, and the blessing only comes through Jesus, which actually is all true. Okay, and I say, yeah, but you better pay attention to what the fulfiller has to say, and what those who follow the fulfiller has to say. So that's where I'm going now. There's a New Testament part to this promise as well. It is where Israel's role in all of this is restated by Jesus and the apostles. I've written about that in detail elsewhere, so I will not repeat that argument here. I've done it in several places. I've done it with my colleague Craig Blazing. I've done it in the books that Mitch and I have edited together. So I try and always pair myself with someone who's more important so that the argument will stick. Anyway, this essay adds another dimension to that discussion. And it is only to note that both the seed par excellence and those who followed him shared in this kind of a hope that included Israel. It's never just Jesus. It's who's connected to Jesus, and part of who is connected to Jesus are people out of Israel who believe what we call the remnant, and then there are things that happen to the remnant in certain of these passages that keep them in the loop. So here I have in mind texts that include Matthew 19:28, which speaks about the apostles being over the 12 tribes of Israel. I mean, how'd that happen? And what does that mean? Or what I call the series of until passages. Luke 13:34 and 35 says, Jesus declares Israel's house desolate until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Now, you don't put an until phrase on something unless there's a time limit for the judgment that you're talking about. Okay? If it were a permanent judgment, you'd say, I declare your house desolate, period, end of story. But he goes on to say, until you say, blessed. He's looking forward to time. It's Jesus talking. Okay? This is the fulfiller talking. Okay? There comes a time when you're going to say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. That's the first until passage. They're all in Luke Acts, where all important theology happens. Luke 21:20 to 24 speaks about Jerusalem being overrun by the nations until the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled. Okay, another text that suggests there's a judgment coming on the capital city. The city is being overrun because of disobedience, but it's not a permanent overrunning that's taking place. Or Acts 22:30 is the equivalent of being appointed over the 12 tribes of Judah. Sorry, Luke 22:30 is the passage that has the 12 appointed over Israel at the Last Supper. Acts 1:6 and 7. This is really interesting. The disciples have spent 40 days with Jesus in his post-resurrection state, being instructed by him. The Great Commission is given during this time, etc. After those 40 days, and right before Jesus departs in ascension, they have one question they want to ask the Lord, okay? Because they're all committed to eschatology and they love the end times. And the question is this the time you're going to restore the kingdom to Israel? Nothing that Jesus has said to them in those 40 days has disabused them of that question. There's going to come a time when Israel comes back into the equation. It's going to be a part of the kingdom. And then Jesus' answer is, I love this, it's not for you to know the times and seasons appointed by the Father, which is a fancy way of saying, I'm not telling, it's none of your business, but God's got it. Okay? It's not, the response to the question is, you know what, that was a terrible question. I just spent 40 days with you trying to get you ready for what's coming, and you're not ready, so I'm going to spend another 40 days with you so you'll get it right and not ask that question at the end. So that's Acts 1, 6, and 7. Acts 3, 18 to 22 is another until passage. It says, heaven must hold the Messiah until the times of refreshing come. And then it goes on to say this. And those times of refreshing were written about by the holy prophets of old, which means if you want to understand what's coming and what Jesus is going to do when he comes back, just read your Hebrew scriptures. They already said it. And I've just taken you through some of those texts. Okay, so we just fulfilled Acts 3, 18 to 22, only I didn't tell you. In Acts 26, 7, Paul says, I'm on trial for the hope of the 12 tribes, which includes the resurrection and everything that comes with it. And then there is the final key passage in Romans 9 to 11, which most of you, if you've been to anything that Chosen People Ministries has ever put on, you'll know what this passage is. But this is a discussion of the remnant and what is going on. How is it that this message, which was for Israel, has been rejected by so many in Israel, and what does that mean? And you know that it's rejecting Israel that he's talking about because he says, I wish I were accursed for the people who don't, because of the people who don't believe. I wish they could believe and I could take their place. That's basically what he's saying. I wish I could have the re-crucifixion, not of Jesus, but of me, so that Israel could be saved. That's where Paul's heart is. And then as you read through Romans 9 to 11, in the end, it talks about the fact that the Gentiles, as unnatural branches, have been grafted into the promise that's pictured as a tree. Been grafted into the tree, and the natural branches have been cut off. Only that isn't where the passage ends, because Paul goes on to suggest, look, if God could take unnatural branches and graft them into a tree, how easy do you think it would be for him to take natural branches and do the same? To which the answer is, that's a good question. Think about that a little while. And then he goes on to say he's looking forward to the time when there is a massive response, and he says, and all Israel will be saved. It's in the context of the way the promise has played itself out, so that Jews and Gentiles are united in Christ. The blessing has gone out into all the world. Israel is meeting and will receive the promises that are part of her, of which the land is a part. But it isn't a nationalism. This is really important. It isn't a nationalism because it takes place in the context of a reconciliation that binds Israel to the other nations. And so I say, so what analogy can I give you that will let you know what this is like? Okay, now I'm going to stretch your boundaries for a second. I'm going to ask you to think of Europe for a second. Okay, so you just got on a plane, and we didn't fly to Britain, because I don't know what to do with Britain in relationship to Europe. Okay, all right? But we're either in Paris or in Frankfurt. We're somewhere in Rome. Take your pick. When you think of the European Union, it's, in one sense, it's one political entity. It's Europe. But on the other hand, there are still Italians there. There are still Germans there. There are still the French there, okay? So they have their nationality on the one hand, but they're all united on the other. And the difference was so great that when I first went to Germany the first time for my first sabbatical, and the union wasn't totally established yet, when I got to the German-French border, I had to pull out a thing called a passport and show it to a soldier on the border so he would let me into France. I went back the next time, my next sabbatical, 6, 7 years later. Okay, I'm making the same drive on the same road. I get to the railroad track that marks the boundary, and there are no customs anywhere to be found. I get welcome to France. All right, so that's the picture of what it is that you're dealing with. This is where the promise in part takes us. It takes us all to the land of God's promise and presence. It's unity and diversity. It's equality and yet distinction. It's a perpetual evidence of the reconciliation of God. One of the reasons Israel stays in the story is because Israel represents a part of the picture of the reconciliation between formerly estranged people who God has now brought together corporately, which is why there's so much Jew and Gentile in the New Testament. You know, I used to read the New Testament and go, why is all this Jew-Gentile stuff here? I mean, I don't understand why God seems to be preoccupied with the Jew and the Gentile. Why would that be? Well, it's because he's showing two people with very separate histories, very separate religious beliefs, now united in what it is that God has done through Jesus Christ. And that's where the shalom comes from. It's from that unity that he creates that way and through that means. You drop Israel out of the picture, okay, and you've lost your picture of reconciliation if you're not careful. So God, it's a perpetual evidence of the reconciliation God brings to all and to all the nations through his work of new covenant in his Davidic heir in his kingdom. Israel stands at the center for the world because of her Messiah. And in it all, God has done one thing. He's kept his word to the patriarchs of Israel, because God keeps his promises to those with whom he makes them. Thank you very much.